just as this flood of new immigration comes from Asia as well, right? And so I imagine that perhaps some of the folks in the movement probably had nothing to do with these new immigrants that bypassed the urban centers and went straight to the suburbs, for instance, or went to other parts of the country. I know the JCL in particular had continued to have a lot of debates and dissension in its ranks, you know, like for decades, right? I mean, I know maybe some of it's still going on about the wartime politics. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's just one of the points in my books, that not everyone thinks alike, really. You know, we don't all look alike, but we don't all think alike either. Yeah.
Well, I love the kind of ambiguity of the book and that unpredictability, the surprise point that it was often Asian American activists who were pushing for inclusion who participated in creating the model minority stereotype. And I think it's so interesting because if you're coming at it from a kind of activist persuasion, you're wondering like, well, what is the takeaway of that? Because you often say it's sort of like an unintended consequence of what they were doing. And you know, so I remember thinking about the first time I went to the Asian American Studies conference. There was a professor there who was from an older generation. He was like, you know, I'm very confused because when I was a kid, I would always tell people, I'm not Asian, I'm American. And it was all about like not being othered, like we're not foreigners, you know. And he's like, I'm very confused because my kids are all now, no, we're Asian. Like we're part of like, you know, 2 billion people, you know. And so from the perspective of like Asian American activists who are always like, we're not the perpetual foreigners, like there's a way where they're kind of colluding in the mono minority stereotype, which isn't to say that it's like automatically bad, but it is a sort of thing where your like kind of cultural politics have unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a way in which, you know, it was hard to write the book in a way, right? Because I felt there were some political stakes, and it was kind of scary because the kind of assimilationist politics has been so derided, I guess, in our moment, right, by progressives. But to say maybe at an earlier time, I think it's hard for us to, maybe we shouldn't just use our present framework to judge the people of the, I mean, it's just hard as a historian, right? And I think what is hard in seeing what they did at the time is that many of their claims reproduced normative ideas of what it means to be an American, right? So they were very much about, like, let's say the well, in academic speak, like heteronormative, right? Yeah. Or, you know, like these kinds of gender roles, this kind of military service patriotism, a kind of middle class respectability. And so, you know, I think those are the hard choices we have to make politically today as we decide what claims we want to make. And even claiming to be an American, you know, there's always the other side of that, which is somebody has to be left out. So I think those are hard choices.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could talk about the gender stuff for a second, because it's so fascinating in the book how it's U.S. state power or kind of cultural norms that are creating these gender norms. So like the JCL is sort of like, you know, we're like super hetero, like strapping soldiers, you know, it's like a masculinist narrative. But then the zoot suit writers are like flamboyant and like freak people out.
Right.
I was wondering if you could talk about the like, you know, the gender politics of this.
Yeah, I think the gender politics, I mean, actually, I think what surprised me is that when I started the book as a dissertation and kept revising it into a book, that was very much a book about Asian American masculinity and these changing way that, you know, before World War II, you know, how we had like the bachelor society and the kind of deviant, you know, kind of ideas of, or asexualized or just, you know, weird. You guys seen The Cheat, this 1915 great movie by Cecil B. DeMille, right? This guy is like kind of a very feminized Japanese guy. And so I think a lot of the story, like how it was possible to become a mono-minority, is that those gender ideas had to change, and the ideas about Asian American sexuality had to change, and they basically had to conform to kind of white bourgeois, middle class conventions. And so that is a really, yeah, it is a really big part of the story. On the other hand, the soldier is manly. I will say there's one of the critiques by a Japanese American of the Go for Broke film. Really hated the movie in part because the Japanese American soldiers don't have any romantic entanglements in the film. And he's like, what do you mean? Like, we were like sleeping with, you know, the women of Europe like all the time, but you don't show that in the movie. And so I think there was a way in which that the criticizer felt very, you know, he felt robbed of this, I guess, this kind of manly masculinity-ness, you know, in that story.
Well, they could be sexualized in a way that's not heteronormative too. So the Moynihan report is the report where you know, it's one of many moments where Asians are sort of positioned against blacks. And I was wondering what you thought about in the opposite direction. Like, how did Asian Americans being included in the American project redefine, like, you know, white normatism? You know, so like one thing at the end of the book is you talk about like white Americans feeling threatened because Asian Americans are like too successful, too competitive. You know. But I'm wondering in terms of other things that are more like obviously racialized or gendered or class, like how you think white Americans maybe saw themselves differently as Asian Americans became assimilated.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think in the 40s perhaps the payoff was about a kind of, you know, doing their part for the war effort, which is kind of everyone getting along and this kind of cultural pluralism idea. I suspect that there were probably a strain of white folks maybe who felt like it was, you know, kind of cosmopolitan maybe to have Asian Oriental friends, I guess. And I do think that yes, we start to see by the late 60s and 70s that recurrence of that uneasiness of the yellow peril, but this time the irony being, you know, they're outweighing their whites, they're too successful, and we certainly see that today, right? And so in my next book, I'm hoping to trace out some of that anxiety in the late 20th century.
Maybe we can open it up to questions. There's you right here.
I'll see if I can pull some things out. That was a really great, rich question. Yeah, I mean, back to the World War II issue, certainly one, I think, factor that motivated the United States military to begin re-accepting Japanese Americans as soldiers was not just this idea of assimilating them back into American society, but also to counter Japanese propaganda, that the United States was fighting a racist war. Right? And they felt, and actually that's why, partly why they wanted an all Japanese American regiment. And so part of the reason why many Japanese Americans opposed this plan was that Japanese Americans in the army would have to fight in a segregated troop. They called it Jap Crow, right? People were not happy about that because again, it's that double standard. You're asking us to fight in the name of freedom, democracy, and yet you're putting us in a segregated battalion. But I think foreign policy was very much on the minds of the people who created this, you know, in the federal government and the military. But as for today, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I think a big difference, I think the model minority that we live with today is not exactly the same as the one that came out of this moment in the book in the 60s. And the big reason, I think, is that and what I want to explore in my new project is the role of the market, right? And I think that there's a lot of anxiety about the United States in the global marketplace vis-a-vis China right now in this moment.
It's not communism anymore.
Yeah, it's not so communism so much, but it is about a kind of capitalistic, you know, global competition. And so that's why I think that Tiger Mom, you know, has updated this minority concept that, you know, came from like the 1930s. But I think what she's so savvy about is that she has tapped in not only to this anxiety, will my child get into Stuyvesant High School, but this anxiety about, you know, what will America's fate in the world be with the rising economic giant of China, right? And so, and then this also kind of intersecting with the influx of middle-class, highly educated Asian immigrants. So I think it's going to be actually there's a very different racial terrain in the late 20th, early 21st century that I hope to explore.
Yeah, it is such a perfect allegory. Like, not only is your kid going to be destroyed by the Chinese, straight A student, but your kid is representative of like the American nation, which will be destroyed not by Chinese communism, by Chinese capitalism. We did this event with Sohail Dalatse. He had a book that you might be interested in called Black Star Crescent Moon, and a lot of it's actually about like Afro-Asian like Black Power movements. So he begins the book with like Malcolm X burning his draft card saying, I am a citizen of Asia, so I'm not going to go to war there, and the kind of role of Black liberation and anti-imperialism. But I was thinking about how this Gary Locke, who was the Chinese American ambassador to China, and there was this thing of like playing the like Chinese American multiculturalism versus like monolithic China, and when he was the ambassador, there was sort of outrage in China, I think, from people being like, why are you betraying us, your ancestral people, you should be subverting the Americans.
Yeah, and I think that's the core, that is part of the heart of the story that I wanted to tell, is this this paradox of recognizing Asians as more American because they're foreign. They're essentially at the heart of it that they're still foreign. And maybe that foreignness is threatening or maybe it's useful. And it's on both sides of the Pacific, apparently, right, that there's also that assumption.
Yeah, and I thought that was something that was really complicated and interesting in your book, where you have this one thing of like Asians are perpetually foreigners, and then you have this other thing of model minorities are Asians are always fitting in. So those things seem like they would be contradictory concepts, right? But then by having this international account, you can really see how you can be someone who's kind of fitting in, but also like quarantined as foreign.
I like that, quarantine.
So thank you all for coming and being such a disobedient audience.
Thank you.
Please come to more events. If you'd like to get more involved, please talk with me or Nadia at the back.